Good evening, my friends, wherever you are in the world tonight. Tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? This is a journey into the quiet night, following the soft glow of the North Star. Through fields and forests, across rivers and secret roads, we will walk beside Harriet Tubman, a woman who carried freedom in her heart and led others through the darkness into dawn. Close your eyes, slow your breath, and let the whispers of her story guide you gently toward rest. I was born under the blanket of southern night, and even as a little girl in chains, I remember gazing up through the cracks of our cabin roof at the endless sky, feeling the pull of freedom tug at my soul. In the hush of those warm Maryland evenings, lying on a straw pallet beside my sleeping siblings, I listened to the pine trees whispering in the breeze outside. Their rustling sounded like a lullaby and a prayer all at once, a promise that beyond the fields and swamps that confined me, there was a wider world where I could run free. Though I had never seen that world, I could feel it in my heart. I imagined freedom as a distant star, shining steady and patient, waiting for me to find my way by its light. My body may have been enslaved, but my spirit was always free in those moments under the stars. I often felt that while people could claim my flesh, they could never own my soul. The older folks on the plantation sang spirituals about Moses leading his people out of bondage, and I soaked up every word of those songs like dry earth absorbing rain. Even before I truly understood, I knew their message, that we were meant to be free. I held on to that. Night after night, I would watch one star in particular, the North Star, glittering high in the northern sky, and I sensed it was special. I believed the Lord himself had set that North Star in the heavens to guide me. He gave strength to my weary limbs, and he meant for me to be free. That faith became the secret lantern I carried inside, lighting my way even in the darkest times. I was born Araminta Ross. Everyone called me Minty, in Dorchester County, Maryland, around the year 1822. My mama, Harriet Green, whom we all called Rit, and my papa, Ben Ross, were both enslaved on nearby plantations. I was one of their 9 children, though I didn't get to grow up with all my siblings together for long. You see, slavery's cruelty tore our family apart. I had 3 older sisters, Lena, Mariah Ritty, and Soph, whom I barely got to know. They were sold to distant plantations in the deep South when I was a child, separating them from us forever. I can still remember the day each one was taken away, the helpless rage and sorrow in my mother's eyes as her babies were driven off down the road in a cart. In our little cabin that night, I clung to my mother's skirt as she rocked back and forth, weeping and praying in the dark. Those losses cut deep into me, but even as I wiped my tears, a quiet determination took root in my heart, a promise to myself that if ever I got the chance, I would fight to keep my family and anyone else I loved from being taken away like that. As a child, I had no childhood to speak of. Slavery took that from me early. I was only about 6 years old when Master Brodess began hiring me out to work for other households. Imagine a little girl tasked with caring for a baby, with orders to stay up all night rocking the cradle. That was my first job, nursemaid to an infant, and I was far too young to manage it. When the baby would cry in the night and I couldn't soothe him, the mistress of the house would whip me on my neck and shoulders. I still remember the sting of those lashes and how I'd cry quietly into my blanket afterwards. I missed my mother terribly during those times. The mistress's house was just a few miles away, but to me, it felt like a whole world apart from my family. I would hug my rag doll, just a corn husk wrapped in cloth, and sing the lullabies Mama had taught me, trying to feel safe. Those were lonely days, but they taught me how strong my spirit could be. Even when I was covered in bruises, I would whisper to God at night, asking for His protection and for a taste of freedom one day. I was sometimes made to work in the damp marshlands of Maryland's eastern shore, trudging through mud and water to check trap lines or haul logs. The landscape itself was wild and challenging, full of creeks and swamps, and enslaved children like me were used for tasks suited to the terrain. Once, after long hours wading in cold water, I fell deathly sick with fever and measles. The folks who had hired me out returned me to my master, thinking I might not live. But Mama Rit, with her folk remedies and tender care, pulled me through. No sooner was I on my feet again than I was sent right back out to work. By my early teens, I was driving oxen, plowing fields, and hauling logs with the strength God gave me. One day, when I was about 13 years old, I found myself at a dry goods store that stood near the fields. That afternoon changed my life forever. As I was buying some supplies for the house, I saw an enslaved young man from a neighboring farm burst into the store, eyes wide with fear. He had run away from the fields without permission, perhaps hoping for a chance at freedom. Hot on his heels came the overseer, shouting and enraged. The overseer demanded I help him restrain the young man. In that instant, something in me rebelled. I could never be part of pushing someone back into bondage. I refused. The man bolted for the door, and the overseer, furious at losing his prize, grabbed a heavy iron weight from the counter. He hurled it after the fleeing man with all his might. I didn't even see it coming. The weight struck me right in the head with a sickening force. I remember the world spinning in a blinding pain. Then everything went dark and silent. They carried me back to the Brodess house and laid me on the wooden bench of a loom, so I've been told. I was unconscious, bloodied, and barely breathing. For a time, they didn't bother to fetch a doctor. An injured, enslaved girl was not worth much in their eyes. I was left on that bench for 2 days, hovering between life and death. Eventually, my mother was allowed to come and tend to me. She sat by my side, cooling my fevered head with wet cloths and praying fervently over me. I remained in a deep, comatose sleep for weeks while Mama kept vigil. She later told me that at times my heartbeat was so faint she wasn't sure I was still with her. But God had more work for me to do in this world. Against all odds, I survived. When I finally woke from that injury, I was forever changed. The blow had cracked my skull, and I suffered from dizziness and bouts of pain from that day on. Worse still were the strange sleeping spells that began to plague me. Without any warning, I might suddenly fall into a deep sleep, a sleep so profound that it was like stepping out of time. I could be mid-step carrying a tray of cornmeal or halfway through splitting wood, and then I'd black out, dead to the world for a few minutes or sometimes hours. People around me thought I was lazy or bewitched, but I knew it was due to that head wound. Today, they'd call it epilepsy or narcolepsy. Back then, folks just said I had the fits or sleepy spells. At first it frightened me, losing control like that. But I came to accept these spells as part of my life. There was another effect of that injury, one far more mysterious and wondrous. During those episodes when I lay unconscious, I experienced vivid dreams and visions that felt as real as life. In those visions, I heard music and rushing wind. I saw bright lights and beautiful scenes. More than once, I dreamed I was flying, soaring high above fields and rivers, light as a feather. In one recurring dream, I found myself across a line in the earth, in a place where the fields were full of flowers and no one was chasing me. I saw people with kind, shining faces welcoming me, and my own family there too, free and safe. When I awoke, back in the rough reality of slavery, I held tight to those heavenly visions. I truly felt that the Lord was speaking to me in those dreams, giving me a glimpse of His plan. Those visions fortified my faith to an unshakable degree. I began to speak to God as if He were my constant companion. I trusted that I was in His hands and that He had set me on a path. I didn't know exactly what He had in store for me yet, but I knew I must be ready to follow when the time came. By the grace of God, I recovered enough to return to work, but the injury left me with a kind of fearless edge. Once you've nearly died, some things don't scare you as much. I began to seek out a bit of autonomy wherever I could find it. I bargained with my enslaver. If I could find my own work and earn wages, I would pay him a yearly fee and keep the rest. Surprisingly, he agreed, likely figuring he'd profit either way. So I began hiring myself out on my own terms. I cut timber with a crew of lumbermen, drove oxen and plowed fields, even did odd jobs on the docks. This let me come and go more freely and learn the lay of the land beyond the plantation. One lucky assignment had me working in the woods alongside my father, Ben. He had been promised freedom years before, and indeed my father was eventually manumitted around the time I was in my late teens. He stayed nearby, continuing to work as a woodsman, and now I was able to spend time with him in the swamps and forests. Those days were a gift. Daddy Ben was a quiet, wise man, but he knew the secrets of the wild. Under his guidance, I learned to navigate by the stars and to find my way through the thick underbrush. He showed me how to listen for the voice of the forest, the snap of a twig or the distant call of an owl, and how to move silently under the canopy of cypress and pine. Sometimes we hauled timber down to the local docks and sawmills, where we met black sailors and freedmen who traveled up and down the coast. I listened eagerly to their stories of far-off places where our people walked free. Those sailors shared knowledge of the wider world with us, describing the roads and rivers leading north and whispering about secret routes that runaways could take. Each tale they told was like a spark, lighting up possibilities in my mind. My world was expanding beyond the bounds of the Brodes farm, and with each new thing I learned, I felt more sure that one day I would find a way to reach that freedom I dreamed of. It was around this time that love found me as well. Through the grapevine of our community, I met a free black man named John Tubman. John was gentle and had a steady way about him. In 1844, when I was about 22, we married. I was still enslaved, but John's status as a free man gave me a glimpse of what life might be like beyond bondage. After we wed, I decided to take a new name. I would no longer be Araminta. I wanted a name that held meaning. I chose Harriet after my mother, and took Tubman as my surname, after my husband. Being John's wife brought me small comforts. We lived together in a little cabin, and for a while I could imagine we had a normal life. I could cook our supper in peace and share laughter with him after the day's work. But the shadow of slavery was always there, lurking just outside our door. We both knew that any children I might bear would legally belong not to us, but to my master. I think John hoped that if we kept our heads down and stayed put, we could carve out some happiness where we were. But for me, the dream of freedom only grew stronger. At night, I confided in him about my visions and my plans. He would listen quietly, but he didn't want me to risk the dangers of running away. "The odds are too bad," he would say. I could understand his fear, but I felt in my bones that I had to be free or die trying. In 1849, the fragile peace of my life was shattered. My enslaver, Eliza Brodess, the widow of old Master Brodess, was deep in debt and began to talk of selling me and my brothers to slave traders. The rumor was that we'd be sent south, likely to the chain gangs of Georgia or the cotton fields of Mississippi. I cannot describe the terror this struck in me. Being sold south was the greatest dread of every enslaved person in Maryland. I had seen how it tore families apart forever. I prayed to God with all my strength to save us from that fate. And then a curious thing happened. The very man who had threatened to sell us, my master Edward Brodess, died suddenly. Some folks said it was my prayers answered. It's true that in my desperation, I had whispered a prayer that if God couldn't change that hard man's heart, he should take him out of the way. When I heard Brodess had passed, I was struck with both relief and guilt. I had never wished a death on anyone before. I begged God's forgiveness if my prayer had been too bitter. But the danger for us was not over. Brodess's widow still intended to sell us to settle the estate's debts. Master's death had merely delayed the evil day. I knew then that I could not wait on any human justice. God had given me a chance, and I had to take it. I remembered the stories and whispers I'd gathered about hiding places, about a road running north. The promise of freedom kindled into a bright flame inside me. I reasoned with myself then. There were two things I had a right to: liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other. In those anxious days, as I prepared to risk everything, I began to see my path to freedom as clearly as I saw the rising sun. I had a vision of crossing into the free land of Pennsylvania. In my mind's eye, I saw green fields and lovely flowers and beautiful white ladies who stretched out their arms to me over the line into a new world. I held on to that image whenever my courage faltered. I decided that when the time was right, I would go. My husband John refused to join me. He was a free man and said he wouldn't throw away his life on such a perilous gamble. His refusal hurt me deeply, but I knew nothing would sway me from this course. Quietly, I confided in my two younger brothers, Henry and Ben, and they agreed to attempt the escape with me. Over the summer of 1849, I carefully made plans. I listened for useful information, which roads were less traveled, who might help us. I prayed for guidance. Finally, one night in late September, when the air was crisp and the North Star was blazing in the sky, we slipped away from the only home we had ever known. We left in absolute silence sometime after midnight. I led the way, and my brothers followed close behind. We dared not breathe a word to our parents or friends left behind. It would only put them in danger, and we couldn't risk the news getting out. I remember pausing at the edge of the woods, taking one last look at the cabins where my family slept. The plantation was dark and still. I whispered a promise into the cool night air, that I would come back for the others, for Mama and Daddy somehow. Then I turned my face toward the north. The sky was moonless but clear, and the North Star twinkled above the tree line like God's own beacon. With a deep breath and a prayer in my heart, I stepped forward into the darkness of the forest, my brothers right beside me. The leaves crunched softly under our feet, and the autumn chill kissed our skin. But I felt a warmth inside me. It was the warmth of hope and daring. We were free in that moment, not legally, not yet, but free because we had chosen our own path. And so, guided by starlight and faith, we began our long walk to freedom. My brothers and I had scarcely gone a few miles into the woods on that first night of our escape when their courage began to falter. Henry and Ben grew fearful. The quiet dark played tricks on their minds, and the thought of what would happen if we were caught weighed heavily on them. They begged me to turn back. At first I resisted with all my soul, but I could see the terror in their eyes. Against my heart's desire, I guided them safely home. I knew I would try again soon, even if I had to go alone. Sure enough, within a couple of months, I planned a second attempt, this time with only my faith for company. Before I slipped away that autumn, I sang a quiet farewell song to a trusted friend in the quarter to let her know I was about to go. In the still night air, my voice hummed low. "I'll meet you in the morning. I'm bound for the promised land." Those words were a secret message and a prayer in one. Then, alone, I crept into the woods and started north. I traveled by night, navigating by the stars, just as Daddy Ben had taught me. The North Star beckoned me forward through the thick forests. I moved in silence, like a small shadow slipping under the boughs. Every rustle in the underbrush set my heart pounding. The distant bay of a hound or the crunch of carriage wheels on the road would send me ducking into a hollow log or flattening myself in a ditch. By daylight, I found hiding places, in hollows of trees, in swamps where I covered myself with reeds, anywhere the patrols might not think to look. I survived on handfuls of nuts and berries and the little bread I'd packed. Along the way, I was aided by the invisible network of the Underground Railroad. A few strangers along the road recognized the look of a fleeing soul and gave me shelter. One Quaker family in particular took me in at a critical moment. As dawn was breaking one day, I stumbled up to their farmhouse, exhausted and hungry. The kindly mistress of the house did not speak a word. She simply handed me a broom. I understood. All that day, I swept the yard in plain sight, posing as her hired help. When night fell, her husband tucked me into an empty produce cart and drove me to the next safe house down the line. Such acts of quiet bravery and compassion saved my life. It took me many days of hard travel, roughly 90 miles on foot, but I finally crossed the border from Maryland into Pennsylvania. I knew I was in a free state when I saw a line of wooden posts marking the boundary. Stepping over that line, I felt a sudden stillness. I was free. When I found I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. The morning sun was just beginning to filter through the trees, turning the fields a gentle gold. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. I fell to my knees and wept tears of joy, tears of gratitude. I thanked God over and over for guiding me to liberty. In that moment of pure sunrise and freedom, the world felt brand new and I felt reborn. My rejoicing, however, was bittersweet. As the initial euphoria settled, I realized I stood there in the promised land all alone, a stranger in a strange land with no family by my side. I was free, yes, but my loved ones were still in bondage behind me. I was a stranger in a strange land, I later said. My father, my mother, my brothers and sisters and friends were in Maryland. But I was free, and they should be free. That thought became my new driving force. In Philadelphia, I found work cleaning houses and scrubbing floors. I might have been illiterate and fresh out of slavery, but I was strong and a hard worker, and folks in the city were willing to pay a free woman's wages. I pinched pennies and saved every dollar I could, tucking away money with a single purpose. I would go back and bring my family out of slavery, one by one, if need be. The year after I escaped, a storm blew through the lives of escaped people like me. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which meant that even here in the free states, law officers and regular citizens were obliged to help catch runaways and send us back south. All at once, no black person who had fled slavery was truly safe on American soil. I saw fear take hold of many of the free black folks in Philadelphia. Some began moving further north across the Canadian border. Rather than give in to fear, I allowed that new law to harden my resolve. If the United States wouldn't guarantee our freedom, then I would take my charges all the way to Canada if I had to. Around that time, I received word that lit a fire under me. My niece, Keziah, my sister's child, along with her 2 young children, were about to be sold at auction in Cambridge, Maryland. Keziah was only a little girl when I left. Now she was a young mother facing the same nightmare I thought I'd escaped. I couldn't bear it. I prayed for guidance and felt the Lord urging me to act. I made contact with my brother-in-law, Tom Tubman, who was still in Maryland, and we laid plans to save Keziah. Disguising myself and slipping back into Maryland was terrifying. A $100 reward hung over my own head at that time. But I traveled in secret and reached Tom's house in Baltimore. The auction of Keziah was set for a certain day in December 1850, and we had a daring scheme ready. Tom hid me in a safe place near the auction yard. Meanwhile, Keziah's husband, a free black man named John Bowley, went to the sale pretending to be just another bidder. He managed to win the bid for his own wife and children. As the auctioneer broke for lunch, carelessly leaving the transaction unfinished until he returned, John hurried Keziah and the children away from the slave pen. They fled to a safe house I'd arranged nearby. By the time the alarm was raised, the family was gone, vanished like morning dew. That night, under cover of darkness, John Bowley sailed a small log canoe down the Chesapeake Bay with Keziah and the children hidden on board. 60 miles he went, rowing by the light of the stars until he reached Baltimore. There, just as planned, I met them in the quiet hours before dawn. I will never forget embracing my niece and her little ones, knowing they would not know the whip, nor be sold and separated from each other. We traveled north, moving by night and hiding by day. and I delivered them safely to Philadelphia. It was my first rescue mission, and by God's grace, it would not be my last. Early the next year, 1851, I went back down to Maryland again, this time to bring away my brothers. My brothers Henry and Ben, the same who had turned back before, were overjoyed to see me show up in the dead of night like a ghost from their dreams. I also guided out several other young men from neighboring farms who were eager to escape. On that trip, I safely brought away my youngest brother, who, fittingly enough, was named Moses. After that successful journey, word began to spread among my family still in Dorchester County that Minty had returned and was leading folks to freedom. With each trip, my confidence grew as well. I learned more routes, more tricks, made more allies. I felt God guiding my every step. Later, in 1851, I undertook one of the most painful missions of my life and learned that freedom can come at a personal cost. Ever since I first tasted liberty, I had longed to go back and fetch my husband, John Tubman. I imagined the joy of reuniting with him and offering him a life by my side in the North. So I traveled once more to Dorchester County, my heart brimming with hope. But when I found John, my heart was dealt a cruel blow. In the 2 years since I had fled, he had given me up for dead or never returning. He had taken another wife, a free woman named Caroline. I was stunned. This news was like a physical pain in my chest. I sent word asking John to come join me anyway, to start a new life with his new wife, perhaps. But he refused. He was settled and content where he was, he said, and he would not go north. I remember sitting outside his cabin in the dark, listening to my own breathing, trying to master the anger and hurt welling up inside. I wanted to scream or cry, but I did neither. By the grace of God, I swallowed my personal heartbreak. I realized John Tubman had a right to his own life, and I couldn't force him to dream my dream. So I dried my tears and turned to the small group of other enslaved people who had quietly gathered, hopeful that I might lead them instead. That very night, I guided several other souls, people who did want freedom, out of that area and up the road toward Philadelphia. I focused on their steps, on the road ahead, not behind. Personal sorrow would have to wait. There were others who needed me now. By the end of 1851, the risk of remaining in the northern United States had grown. The new fugitive slave law was leading to midnight raids and kidnappings of black people in the free states. Many folks who had escaped slavery decided that winter to go all the way to Canada. I too concluded that Canada must be the ultimate destination for those I guided. In December of 1851, I led one of my largest expeditions, a group of 11 escapees, north toward the Canadian frontier. Among this group were the Bowley family, my niece Keziah and her husband and children, and others I had helped before. We traveled in the cold of winter to avoid attention, trudging through snow and biting wind. The journey was long, hundreds of miles, but at least some stretches we could travel by wagon or train using forged passes when funds and good friends allowed. During that trip, we had the good fortune to be welcomed by many allies of the Underground Railroad. One of them was the great Frederick Douglass, a formerly enslaved man turned famed abolitionist leader. We stopped at his home in Rochester, New York, where he and his wife fed us and gave us warm beds for a night. I remember watching Mr. Douglass pace in his parlor, running his hand through his hair, saying he was amazed at our courage. Truth be told, I was amazed by him, a man who had escaped slavery himself, and then spoken out so boldly for our people's freedom. After we got my party safely into Canada, Mr. Douglas wrote a letter comparing his efforts to mine. With eloquent humility, he wrote that while he worked in the public eye, I had labored in the night, with the midnight sky and the silent stars as my only witnesses. He praised my heroism in words far finer than I deserved, saying that except for John Brown, he knew of no one who had willingly faced more danger to help enslaved people than I had. I treasure those kind words, but I never felt like a hero. I was just doing what my heart and God compelled me to do. Throughout the 1850s, I returned again and again to the eastern shore of Maryland, each time secretly liberating more family members and friends. I rescued my other brothers, Henry, Ben, and their wives, and some of their children, and numerous friends from neighboring farms. All told, I personally led around 70 people to freedom over about 13 separate journeys. I also provided detailed instructions and support to dozens more who found their way north independently. My clandestine work in those years earned me a revered nickname. People began to call me Moses, after the biblical deliverer who led his people out of bondage. I was humbled by that comparison, but I understood why it took hold. News of my exploits traveled quietly from plantation to plantation. Enslaved folks whispered that Moses had never lost a single passenger on her Underground Railroad. And it was true. Not one person I led north was ever captured. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger. It wasn't easy. There were many close calls and dangerous moments. But with faith and careful planning, we always prevailed. I give the credit to God, who guided and protected me on every journey. To outwit the slave catchers, I relied on every bit of ingenuity I could muster. I favored winter expeditions, when the nights were long and dark and most slave patrols preferred to stay indoors by the fire. I often started my escapes on Saturday nights, knowing that no runaway notices would appear in the newspapers until Monday morning. That bought us precious hours before anyone knew we were gone. I learned to use clever disguises and tricks. Once, while scouting a route, I encountered a former enslaver of mine on a road. In a flash, I grabbed 2 chickens I had been carrying and yanked their ties, setting them to clucking and flapping wildly. The commotion allowed me to duck my head and slip past without his recognizing my face. Another time, I bumped right into an old master on a train. He stared at me, trying to place my face. I calmly opened a newspaper, something no enslaved person was ever taught to do, and pretended to read. He promptly dismissed me as not being Minty, since he knew Minty couldn't read a word. I had many such tricks. I would change my name and demeanor, or feign being a senile old woman wandering aimlessly to avoid suspicion. Travel routes and safe houses were carefully planned with my allies. We had signals for everything. By day, we might send coded messages through an agent with a handwritten note about deliveries of dry goods, meaning people. By night, I used songs as signals. I might approach a plantation softly singing a familiar spiritual like, "Go down, Moses." If it was unsafe to come out, I would sing one version. But if the coast was clear, I would change to a verse that let those in hiding know it was time to move. My faith was my companion on every journey. I spoke with God constantly, asking for guidance at every fork in the road. Those childhood visions of mine persisted, and I listened to what they told me. Often I would have a premonition, a feeling about danger or safety, and I learned to trust it as the voice of the Lord warning me or directing me. If a hiding place didn't feel right, we moved on. If a path felt favored, we took it. And again, we were delivered from harm. When we finally reached free soil, whether in the northern states before 1850 or later all the way in Canada, oh, what rejoicing! We would cry and dance and shout, hallelujah. I remember carrying babies across the final boundary and whispering to them, "You're free now, honey. Never more master's property. You belong only to God." As we crossed into safe territory, I would lift my arms and call out, "Glory to God and Jesus too. One more soul is safe." I did carry a gun on my journeys, an old percussion revolver tucked under my shawl. I never had to fire it in all my years, but I wouldn't hesitate to brandish it to protect my people. Slave catchers and their dogs prowled the woods, and I was prepared to defend my group if cornered. More often, the gun served another purpose. It offered encouragement to those who faltered. Escape was a grueling ordeal, and sometimes fear would overtake one of my passengers partway through. Turning back, however, was not an option. A deserter could betray the rest or face certain torture and death, and I simply couldn't risk it. On one occasion, a man in our party became overwhelmed with dread. He insisted he couldn't go on and wanted to return. I couldn't let him. I quietly drew my revolver, pointed it at his trembling head, and said, "Go on or die." My voice was calm but firm. I meant it. "Dead folks tell no tales," I added softly. The poor man saw that I was truly resolved. With tears in his eyes, he gathered his courage and continued on with us. Several days later, that same man stepped off the ferry into Canada, free as a bird, and dropped to his knees, thanking me for not letting him give up. It was a harsh thing I did, I know that. But freedom had to be preserved at all costs. For him, for us, for the countless others depending on our success. Harsh methods aside, I never lost a single soul on a journey. If anyone fell ill, we stopped and nursed them with wild herbs until they could walk again. If a baby cried, we used soothing balms or a drop of laudanum to keep the child quiet as we slipped past danger. We did whatever it took. Failure was not in my vocabulary. By the mid-1850s, I had helped so many escape that the slave masters of Maryland were in an uproar. They held angry meetings, scratching their heads over how so many enslaved people were disappearing. They spread rumors of a shadowy figure leading escapees. Some swore it must be a cunning man, or maybe a northern white abolitionist in disguise. They never suspected it was a petite black woman, a formerly enslaved Minty they had once dismissed as a half-disabled dreamer. Angry slave owners supposedly put together rewards to catch the elusive Moses. I later heard talk of a fantastical $40,000 bounty being placed on my head, a king's ransom. But that was likely an exaggeration born of their frustration. Historians never found proof of such a sum. Real or not, it wouldn't have mattered. No one ever captured me or any of my people. The good Lord had his arms around us. Of all the missions I undertook, the one closest to my heart was the rescue of my father and mother. After freeing so many others, I yearned to give my own mama and daddy the gift of freedom in their lifetime. My father, Ben Ross, had actually been manumitted years back in 1840, and he continued to live and work in Maryland as a free man. My mother, Rit, eventually was supposed to be freed as well. Her former master had promised in his will that she'd be freed at the age of 45. But that promise was not honored, and she was never formally emancipated. By the 1850s, my parents were elderly and still in the Eastern Shore area. In 1857, I got word that my father was in grave danger. Although he was free, he had been hiding some escaped slaves in his cabin, a bold and risky thing to do. Authorities found out and were looking to arrest him. If caught, he could be thrown in prison, or worse. And my mother might be sold off in retaliation despite her age. I knew it was time to bring them north. That winter, I traveled one more time back to the old homestead. Under cover of darkness, I knocked quietly on the door of the cabin at Poplar Neck where I had grown up. "Who's there?" my father's voice called. "It's me, Minty," I whispered. There was a stunned silence. Then the door flew open, and my mother pulled me into her arms, tears of joy on her cheeks. I quickly explained we had to go, and go now. My father had been expecting this. Perhaps he had even packed a little bundle, because he nodded and said, "I'm ready." My mother, though frail and stiff in her joints, stood tall and agreed it must be done. That very night, I led my mother and father, who were in their 70s, stealthily through the woods to a wagon I had prepared. We bundled them under blankets and some produce and drove off slowly, taking back roads and swamp trails to avoid detection. It touched me to see that even in their fear, my parents' faith was strong. Mama Rit murmured Bible verses under her breath as the wagon jostled along, and Daddy Ben squeezed my hand and said, "Lead on, daughter." And so I did. Despite the cold and the long miles, we made it to St. Catharines, Canada, where a community of formerly enslaved people, including other relatives and friends, greeted my parents like beloved elders coming home. How sweet it was to see Mama and Daddy rest easy, finally, on free soil. I had fulfilled one of my deepest prayers by delivering them from slavery's reach. By the end of the 1850s, the winds of change were swirling violently across America. I continued to aid freedom seekers when I could, and I also became involved with the wider abolitionist movement. I attended anti-slavery meetings and spoke to Northern audiences about my experiences, though I never liked the spotlight much. It was around this time I met a man who would have a profound impact on me. John Brown. From the moment I heard him speak, I recognized a kindred spirit. Captain Brown, as I called him, was a white man with fiery eyes and a prophet's beard who believed fiercely that slavery was an abomination against God. Unlike most, he was willing to take up arms to destroy the institution. He told me he felt called by God, much as I felt guided by God's voice myself. In 1858, Captain Brown was plotting a bold strike, a raid to seize a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and spark a slave uprising. He had heard of General Tubman, as he took to calling me, and sought my help. Flattered by that nickname and moved by his passion, I agreed to advise him. I shared with him my knowledge of secret trails and my contacts among freedmen and escaped slaves in the border states. I even helped him recruit a few willing fighters from Canada. We spent long evenings by candlelight discussing strategy and scripture. John Brown had the zeal of an Old Testament warrior, and I truly believed he was an instrument of divine justice. In 1859, as he put his plan into action, I fell ill and couldn't join the final raid. I've often wondered how things might have gone if I had been there. As it happened, Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in October 1859 failed, and he was captured. When John Brown was hanged that December, I was heartbroken. I mourned him deeply, as did so many who called him a martyr for freedom. To a friend I said, "He done more in dying than 100 men would in living." I meant that his sacrifice shook the nation. It stirred up a righteous anger and opened many eyes in the North to the true stakes of the struggle. In my heart, I felt certain that Brown's death would not be in vain. A great storm, a war, was coming, and I believed it would sweep away slavery once and for all. Sure enough, by 1860 the United States was on the brink of civil war. The divide between free states and slave states had become a chasm. I had resettled my parents in Auburn, New York, where we'd been given a home by Senator Seward's kind family, and I was living there quietly when news arrived in April 1861 that fighting had broken out between North and South. The Civil War had begun. When I heard cannons had fired at Fort Sumter, I bowed my head and murmured, "Thank you, Lord." The hour has come. I say this not out of any love of violence, but because I had long foreseen, in visions and in my deepest prayers, that a war was needed to purge this land of slavery's sin. I had a vision early in the war that this conflict would end with my people freed, and I held on to that promise through the dark days ahead. The war gave me a chance at a different kind of service. I was a woman, and not a young one at that, around 40. But I was strong, skilled, and absolutely determined to help the Union defeat the slaveholders. When the call came for volunteers to aid the Union Army, I knew it was my next mission. With the same faith that had carried me through forests at midnight, I packed my bags, kissed my elderly parents goodbye, and headed south once again. This time not in secret, but in uniform, to serve the cause of freedom on a new battlefield. I spent the Civil War years doing anything and everything I could to help my people's liberation. In early 1862, I made my way to Union-held territory, first to camps around Fort Monroe, Virginia, and then further south to the Sea Islands of South Carolina. There, in the Port Royal region, I joined a community of formerly enslaved contrabands, as the Union called them, and Northern missionaries working to support the Union war effort. I met Union officers who, once they learned of my background, gladly welcomed my help. At first, I served as a nurse and cook for the troops and contraband refugees. I was no stranger to nursing. I had tended the wounded and sick all my life. In the makeshift hospitals of Port Royal, I prepared remedies from local roots and herbs to treat soldiers suffering from dysentery and smallpox. I would slip into the pine woods to gather red bark for fevers or wild onions for infections. Many a night I sat by a cot holding a young soldier's hand, wiping his brow with cool water and humming a gentle hymn to lull him to rest. At first, the Union quartermasters gave me rations for my work, but when I heard grumblings that a black woman was getting special treatment, I surrendered my rations and instead earned my keep by baking pies and brewing root beer in the evenings to sell to the soldiers. I wasn't about to let anyone say I took advantage. All I wanted was to do God's work and help free our people. Not all Union officers were as anti-slavery as I would have liked. President Lincoln, especially in the first years of the war, seemed hesitant to make the war about emancipation. That frustrated me. I understood his political reasons, but in my heart I knew what God required. I said as much to anyone who'd listen. God won't let Master Lincoln beat the South till he does the right thing, I told a Union colonel one day. Master Lincoln, he's a great man, and I am a poor Negro. But the Negro can tell Master Lincoln how to save the money and the young men. He can do it by setting the Negro free. In time, Lincoln came around. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued on January 1st, 1863. I remember the day well. I was in South Carolina, and we held a praise meeting that night, singing "My Country 'Tis of Thee," with altered lyrics of our own to celebrate freedom. The proclamation didn't free everyone. Loyal border states still kept slaves a while longer. But it turned the tide. From that point on, wherever Union armies went, freedom followed. For me, the proclamation was a green light to take more direct action against the Confederacy. No longer just a nurse, I became an active scout and spy for the Union Army. Early in 1863, under the orders of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, I was asked to lead a team of scouts to gather intelligence in the South Carolina Low Country. At last, here was a chance to use the skills I'd honed on the Underground Railroad for the Union cause. My small band, all black scouts familiar with the area, slipped through the marshes and woods, mapping the unfamiliar terrain and noting the positions of rebel outposts. I often went in disguise, much as I had back in Maryland. We would pose as simple farm women or as servants, gleaning what information we could from talkative Confederate sympathizers. We crept along back roads, observing troop movements, and rowed small boats through the maze of tidal creeks to spy on rice plantations. My knowledge of covert travel and subterfuge proved invaluable. We delivered report after report to the Union commanders. One of those commanders was Colonel James Montgomery, the same fiery abolitionist who led the Black 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. He took a liking to me, calling me Mama Moses, and together we began planning something audacious. That plan culminated on the night of June 2nd, 1863, with the famous Combahee River raid. I still get shivers remembering how it felt, standing on the deck of a Union gunboat in the darkness, chugging up the Combahee River with freedom in our minds. I served as a guide for Colonel Montgomery's 3 gunboats, leading them through the twisting channels and past the Confederate mines, torpedoes, that had been planted in the waters. The moon was just a sliver, the banks of the river a blur of dense foliage. I had gathered crucial intelligence from local black folks beforehand. We knew where the mines were and which plantations along the river were most vulnerable. I also spread the word among the enslaved population in secret. When you hear the Union steam whistles, it means deliverance is at hand. As the first light of dawn began to silver the horizon, our boats struck. Union soldiers stormed ashore at several estates, and the gunboats blew their whistles loud and long, a triumphant peal that echoed over the broad river. I went ashore with the troops on one side of the river, my heart pounding not with fear, but with exhilaration. Enslaved men, women, and children, forewarned by my network, came pouring out of the fields and slave quarters, running toward the riverbank where freedom awaited. It was chaos of the most glorious kind. I saw women balancing steaming pots of rice on their heads, unwilling to leave the precious food behind, babies clinging to their necks. I saw strong young men helping the elderly hobble toward the water's edge. Pigs squealed in burlap sacks slung over shoulders, and chickens fluttered in people's arms. Folks tried to bring along what little they could, or maybe they just didn't want those plantation owners to keep even a pig. The overseers and Confederate soldiers on site were caught utterly off guard. A few fired shots or shouted orders, but in the tumult of our raid, with buildings burning and Union cavalry whooping, their efforts were useless. One hostile overseer raised his gun at a fleeing woman, and a Union soldier knocked him flat before he could do any harm. The sight of black Union troops fighting on behalf of the enslaved was enough to send most of the rebels running. Right in the thick of it all, I stood on the gunboat ramp, waving my arms and shouting for people to come on, come on. Over the din, I began to sing, picking a verse from an old song called Uncle Sam's Farm that we had taught the slaves for this moment. Its lyrics urged, come along, meaning the time was now. Hearing my voice, hundreds surged forward even faster. I reached out and grabbed hold of children, hoisting them up onto the boat, 2 or 3 at a time. I clasped hands with mothers and pulled them aboard, urging them to make room for others behind. The small gunboats filled quickly, each one packed deck to deck with freedom seekers, their eyes wide with fear and hope. Those who couldn't fit aboard the first boats waited on the shore for the next pickup, cheering us through tears as we pulled away. In total, we rescued more than 750 enslaved people along the Combahee that day. 750 souls set free in one bold stroke. As our boat steamed off toward the Union lines at Beaufort, the sun broke through the morning mist, and I looked back to see the riverbank teeming with people waving and crying out in jubilation. My eyes overflowed with tears of my own. It was the largest single liberation operation in the Civil War, and the Lord had seen fit to make me a part of it. The Combahee raid was a stunning success. The northern newspapers got hold of the story and praised my patriotism, sagacity, energy, and ability in leading the mission. They started calling me General Tubman again, hearkening back to John Brown's nickname for me. I must admit, that made me smile. I didn't do any of it for glory. I did it for my people. But it felt good to have our efforts recognized. More importantly, over 100 of the liberated men from the Combahee went on to join the Union Army themselves, bolstering our fight with their newfound freedom. I stayed on in the South after the raid, continuing to scout and skirmish. The Confederate forces had learned to fear this black woman scout who knew the swamps better than they did. A few weeks later, in July 1863, I witnessed the heroic assault of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, one of the first black Union regiments, on Fort Wagner in Charleston Harbor. I had assisted their young colonel, Robert Gould Shaw, by cooking some last meals for his men before they embarked on that fateful attack. I stood at a distance on the eve of the battle, handing out cornbread and baked beans to those brave black soldiers, sensing the solemn resolve in the air. That night, I prayed hard for their safety. when the Battle of Fort Wagner began, I was positioned with support units, and from where I was, I could see the flashes of artillery like distant lightning. As the fighting raged, it looked to me like a terrible thunderstorm out over the dunes. The musket fire was the lightning, the boom of cannon the thunder, and in my heart I knew the rain falling was the blood of heroes. When dawn broke, Fort Wagner still stood in rebel hands, and the field was strewn with fallen men like a harvest of death. Among them was Colonel Shaw himself, who died gallantly atop the parapet. I helped tend the wounded that could be retrieved, cradling broken men who only hours before had been so full of courage. That day, my heart ached with sorrow. But I also felt pride. Pride in what those black men had proven to the world in combat. I thought of Colonel Shaw, a white officer who had given his life leading black troops, and I whispered, "He done more in dying than 100 men would in living," echoing my sentiment about John Brown. The sacrifice of these martyrs only steeled my resolve to keep going. For 2 more years, I worked for the Union forces, tending to newly liberated people, scouting into Confederate territory, and nursing wounded soldiers in Virginia, a task I continued for some months, even after the Confederacy surrendered in April 1865. By war's end, I had the satisfaction of knowing I'd played a part, however small, in slavery's final downfall. In April 1865, when General Lee surrendered and word rippled out that the war was over, I was in a hospital camp in Virginia. I shall never forget the rejoicing that erupted among the freed people and black soldiers. Grown men shouted and embraced each other. Women fell to their knees, sobbing tears of joy. Children danced, not fully understanding, but happy because everyone else was. I simply sat down on a log and let the tears flow freely down my face. "Thank you, Lord," I whispered. "Thank you for letting me see this day. All the pain and struggle, all the prayers and peril, it had not been in vain." Chains were breaking everywhere, and the promise I had clung to all my life was being fulfilled. When I returned home to Auburn in the summer of 1865, I was bone-tired and battle-worn, yet filled with a quiet sense of victory. Slavery, that cruel beast, was dead. I had done my duty, on the battlefield and off. However, the end of the war did not bring an end to my personal challenges. I had spent over 3 years in Union service, but I was never properly paid my due. I wasn't a regular soldier, so the Army bureaucracy didn't quite know what to do with me. They gave me some payments here and there for scouting, but my work as a nurse was entirely unpaid. All told, for over 3 years of service, I received just $200. It hardly mattered to me then. I hadn't served for money. But it became a thorny issue later when I needed that pension support in old age. Still, I had my reward in the history we made. Upon returning to the North, I took a train through New Jersey on my way to New York. On that ride, I encountered a bitter taste of the prejudice that lingered even after slavery's demise. I had a half-fare railroad ticket, provided to wounded soldiers and wartime nurses like me, and I seated myself in a car that wasn't the smoking car, which was dirty and crowded. The conductor, seeing a black woman in a regular car, roughly told me to move. I refused. I was a uniformed Union nurse and had every right to sit there. But that conductor called me names, and with the help of some white passengers, forcibly dragged me out of the car despite my protests. In the tussle, My arm was broken. It was a humiliating and painful experience. Here I was, with my victory medal and worn bonnet, having just helped free hundreds of people. Yet I was treated like a criminal for simply sitting where I chose. The injustice of it burned, but I bore it with as much dignity as I could. I told myself that freedom's journey was not over. There were new battles for equality ahead. Back in Auburn, I settled into the quiet life of caring that had always been my lot. My parents were aging and needed me. I tilled the little farm we had, grew vegetables and fruit, raised some pigs and chickens. I took in boarders, black travelers who had nowhere else to stay, or local folks down on their luck. My home became a haven for anyone in need. If an orphan needed shelter, I gave it. If an elderly person needed food, I cooked it. Many nights I fell asleep utterly exhausted from the day's labor, only to rise before dawn and start again. But I was content in a way. The war was won. Slavery was over. And I was blessed to be surrounded by family and those I loved. In 1869, the Lord saw fit to grant me another companion for my earthly journey. I married Nelson Davis, a fine young man who had served in the 8th United States Colored Infantry during the war. Nelson was more than 20 years my junior. But that never mattered to us. We understood each other. He had gentle eyes and a quiet strength, much like my father's. We made our vows on a beautiful spring day in the local church. I wore a simple dark dress and a shawl, nothing fancy. But I felt like a girl again standing beside him, so happy and hopeful. In our years together, Nelson was a devoted husband. He took care of the heavy farm work when my back began to ache, and in the evenings he would sit and listen to my stories without complaint, even if he'd heard them 10 times before. Those were peaceful years. A few years after our marriage, in 1874, Nelson and I adopted a baby girl. Her name was Gertie, and she was just a tiny little thing who had no one else in the world. We took her in as our own. Oh, how I doted on that child. She brought a youthful light back into our home. I would rock Gertie in the very chair my mother used to rock me, humming the same lullabies I once heard under the stars. The ache from my old wounds and the worries about money would melt away whenever I held her warm little body and felt her tiny hand pat my cheek. In nurturing Gertie, I found a measure of the childhood joy that had been stolen from me so long ago. Times were often hard financially. Despite my legendary deeds, I lived in poverty for many years after the war. I had to fight long and hard to receive any sort of pension from the government. Eventually, in the 1890s, I was granted a widow's pension of $8 a month after Nelson passed. He died of tuberculosis in 1888. God rest him. A few years later, with the help of some influential friends, Congress agreed to increase my pension, adding $12 a month for my own wartime nursing service. They still refused to acknowledge me as a scout or soldier, but I took what I could get. Money was always tight. Yet, whenever I had a little extra, I continued to share it or invest it in helping others. Friends of mine in the abolitionist community never forgot me. In 1869, one such friend, Sarah Hopkins Bradford, wrote a small book titled Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman. It told some of my story, at least the parts I was willing to share. And she arranged for the proceeds, about $1,200, to go to me. That money saved my home from foreclosure at a critical time. I am forever grateful to Sarah for using her pen to come to my aid. In my later years, I continued to lend my voice to causes of freedom and justice. When the fight turned to women's suffrage, I was right there alongside the likes of Susan B. Anthony and Emily Howland. I traveled to New York, Boston, and Washington, D.C., speaking at women's rights meetings. I wasn't a polished speaker, I just spoke plain truth from my heart. But the crowds would often rise to their feet when I was done, not because of fancy words, but because of the life behind them. Once, a white lady asked me if I really believed women ought to vote. I suffered enough to believe it, I replied simply. That became one of my famous lines, though to me, it was just the honest truth. I had borne chains on my wrists and a rifle on my shoulder. I had lived as equal to any man in danger and toil. Why shouldn't women have the same rights as men at the ballot box? Many times, after I spoke, young women, black and white both, would crowd around me and squeeze my hands, thanking me. I would tell them, "We'll all be free together. The Lord intended it so." Those were good fights, and I'm proud I had a role in them. One dream especially had tugged at me for decades: to provide a safe and comfortable home for elderly black folks who had no one to care for them. In 1896, I took a leap of faith and purchased 25 acres of land near my home to start such a place. I scraped together the money with help from donations and a mortgage. And by 1908, we opened the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged on that property. We named the main house John Brown Hall, honoring my old friend. The journey to get the home up and running was not easy. Fundraising was slow, and at one point I nearly lost the land because I couldn't pay the taxes. Eventually, the AME Zion Church stepped in to manage it, and a board was formed to keep it going. There was a rule established that residents should pay an entrance fee. I argued against it, saying I wanted no one turned away for lack of money. But either way, by God's grace, we succeeded in creating a place where old folks could live out their days with dignity. The opening day ceremony in June 1908 was one of the proudest moments of my life. They sat me in a place of honor on the porch, and people sang spirituals and gave speeches praising my work. All I could think was, this was the Lord's doing. He had carried me from the narrow cabin of slavery to this expansive vision of service. As the years gently carried me into old age, my body grew frail. The headaches and buzzing in my head from that childhood injury never fully ceased, and in the late 1890s, when I was around 70, I took the remarkable step of having brain surgery to try to relieve the pressure. In Boston, a doctor actually sawed open my skull and raised it up a bit, and I endured the operation with no anesthesia, biting down on a bullet to manage the pain. I've been told this astonished the surgeons, but to me, it was nothing compared to the trials I'd faced. I figured if Civil War soldiers could grit their teeth through amputations, I could survive a little skull tinkering. After it was over, I did feel some relief, thank the Lord. And I carried that bullet they gave me as a sort of strange keepsake, a reminder of my stubborn will to live free of pain. By 1911, I could no longer get around as I used to. The years of hard living had left me weak, and I began to need constant care. I moved into the home for aged that I had founded becoming not the matron now, but a fellow resident among those I had hoped to help. The staff there treated me with such kindness and respect. "Ms. Tubman," they would say, "let us carry your tray," or "Ms. Tubman, you must rest now." It was odd at first to have others doing for me what I had always done for others, but I learned to accept it with grace. In truth, it was a comfort. I spent my final years sitting in a rocking chair on the porch when the weather was warm, swapping stories with the other elders, or indoors by the stove on wintry days, piecing quilts and humming old hymns in my soft, raspy voice. Young people from the town would come to visit, Sunday school children, church ladies, reporters even, and they'd ask me to tell them about the old days. Sometimes I would oblige with a vivid tale, perhaps how I outfoxed those patrollers by pretending to read, and how they nearly fell over in surprise. I'd chuckle, and the children would giggle, not quite believing the little old lady before them had once been a daring spy. Other times, especially in the evenings when the light grew dim, I would just sit quietly and remember. I remembered the pine-scented woods of Maryland and the whispers of the Underground Railroad in the brush. I remembered the faces of the weary souls I led, how they looked when fear turned to hope as we crossed into freedom. I remembered the silent stars above, my faithful friends that guided me night after night. My life had been long and brimmed full, and each memory was like a prayer I offered up, thanking God for bringing me through. In March of 1913, as I approached my 91st birthday, I fell ill with pneumonia. I took to my bed in the home, feeling my strength ebb day by day. The room was often full of friends and relatives. My beloved niece, who had been like a daughter to me, sat at my bedside holding my hand. The sisters from the AME Zion Church gathered to sing comforting hymns in low voices. I drifted in and out of sleep, the boundary between this world and the next growing thin and porous. One night, as fever took me, I had the most beautiful dream. I was flying again, just as I used to in my childhood visions. I flew over green fields and clear rivers, northward and upward, and all around me I heard the faint sound of angels singing. I saw my mama and papa standing on a distant shore, their arms open wide, smiling proudly. And I saw so many familiar faces behind them, brothers and sisters I had lost, soldiers from the war, friends from long ago, all free of pain, all radiant with joy. When I awakened, I knew what was coming, and I was at peace. On the afternoon of March 10th, 1913, I felt the veil drawing closed. I gathered enough strength to speak to the loved ones crowded around my bed. I wanted to comfort them, to ease their sorrow. So I quoted the words of Jesus that had always given me comfort. "I go to prepare a place for you." It was my way of saying we would meet again, that I was simply going on ahead, like I'd done so many times on the road to freedom. Those around me later said I passed with a smile on my face. I like to think that's true. With family and friends praying around me, I closed my eyes and slipped away as gently as a whisper. In that final moment, it was as if I stood once more on the banks of a great river at night. But this time, the river was life itself, flowing into eternity. I could see the far shore faintly, a promised land beyond pain and struggle. And just like all those times before, I felt no fear, for I knew God was with me, guiding me like the North Star, Perhaps my dear ones couldn't see what I saw, but I hoped they could feel it, the peace that passed over me. I was buried with semi-military honors a few days later in Auburn's Fort Hill Cemetery. The local militia gave me a 3-volley salute, and a bugler played taps as the sky wept a light rain. They folded the American flag and handed it to my family in recognition of my service. It was a humble ceremony, but I felt the presence of countless souls there with me in spirit. The souls of every person I had helped find freedom. Standing in silent tribute, my story might have ended that day, but my legacy lives on. In the many years since I left this earth, people have remembered me in songs and statues, books and legends. They've called me an American hero, an icon of courage and freedom. And I suppose I am. But when the night is deep and quiet, and someone speaks my name in reverence, I hope they also feel the simple truth behind it, that I was just an ordinary woman whom God called to extraordinary purpose. I had the quiet courage to follow the call of liberty, step by step, no matter how dark the path, and to trust that a brighter morning lay ahead. Now, dear friend, as you lie here listening in the gentle darkness, perhaps you can feel a bit of my journey in your own soul. The world around us may be dark sometimes, but above us the stars still shine, steady, faithful, guiding. When you face trials, remember my story and the North Star that guided me. Remember that every soul longs for freedom, and every soul carries a light within. If ever you feel lost or burdened or in need of courage, picture me by your side, a small black woman in a faded shawl, humming a soothing tune and pointing upward to that star that never falters. Keep going, I would whisper to you. If you want a taste of freedom, keep going. It's time now to rest. Let the sweet peace of the night enfold you like a warm quilt. You are safe here, safer than many of those I once led under the cover of darkness. Feel the love and bravery in these words settle over you like a gentle dew. Close your eyes and breathe easy, knowing that others who came before, myself included, have walked hard roads so that you might lie down in freedom and security. In your dreams, perhaps you'll find yourself walking through a pine forest at my side. The air will be cool and fresh, the ground soft underfoot. We won't say a word, but you'll hear the night birds and the distant sound of a river. And above, through the treetops, that North Star will wink kindly at you. And when dawn comes, you'll awaken renewed, with the light of liberty warming your heart like the rising sun. Until then, I wish you good night and God bless. May you sleep sound, cradled in the knowledge that all souls are meant to be free, and that morning is always coming, shining and golden, just beyond the horizon of even the darkest night. It's time now to rest. Let the sweet peace of the night enfold you like a warm quilt. You are safe here, safer than many of those I once led under the cover of darkness. Feel the love and bravery in these words settle over you like a gentle dew. Close your eyes and breathe easy, knowing that others who came before, myself included, have walked hard roads so that you might lie down in freedom and security. In your dreams, perhaps you'll find yourself walking through a pine forest at my side. The air will be cool and fresh, the ground soft underfoot. We won't say a word, but you'll hear the night birds and the distant sound of a river. And above, through the treetops, that North Star will wink kindly at you. And when dawn comes, you'll awaken renewed, with the light of liberty warming your heart like the rising sun. Until then, I wish you good night and God bless. May you sleep sound, cradled in the knowledge that all souls are meant to be free, and that morning is always coming, shining and golden, just beyond the horizon of even the darkest night. Good night.